Legendary comics writer and editor Jim Shooter passed away on Monday at the age of 73 after a battle with esophageal cancer. Shooter's legacy in shaping comics and its trajectory from kid stuff to nerd stuff to a billion-dollar industry is legendary in both its ups and its downs. In a lot of ways, the story of comics is the story of 20th century America, and Jim Shooter lived it and shaped it in a lot of ways. This week, I'm covering Jim Shooter's life and legacy in and out of comics. Thanks, Jim, for everything. I'm Dan Umpton, and this is the Doomcast. First off, do me a favor, hit subscribe and the bell. I make about one of these videos a week. They are all great, so please don't miss even one. First and foremost, Jim Shooter was a Yinzer. He grew up in Pittsburgh, son of a steelworker father. Both of his parents, children of Polish immigrants, both working class. Shooter broke into comics after surgery that he had as a child. He was about 13 years old, and he spent time in his convalescence writing and drawing Legion of Superhero stories that he started sending to DC. Ultimately, and surprisingly for a 13, 14-year-old, DC editor Mort Weisinger started buying and then commissioning stories from him for Supergirl, Superboy, and later Legion of Superheroes. For a while, his Legion run was huge. He created the Fatal Five, Karate Kid, Pharaoh Lad, Princess Projectra, even created Parasite and Superman. Now, for those of you who are reading comics now, you're like, Legion of Superheroes, that's old-time stuff. At the time, it was the biggest selling comic in the world. It was one of the biggest selling books on a regular basis. It was the biggest thing. It was the X-Men of its time. And a 14-year-old kid got commissioned to write it. That's an insanely huge deal. You might be asking yourself, was he actually that good? Yeah, he was that good. He understood visual storytelling really well right off the bat. Back home, all of the money that he was making was going to his struggling parents, who, despite working full-time, were dealing with a lot. His father's car was a piece of garbage, according to him, and at the time did not have a working engine. Shooter says that his very first paycheck from DC Comics went to buy a new engine for the family car so that his dad didn't have to walk to work anymore. The rest of his money, up until he started college, apparently also went to his family. And of course, he had been accepted to NYU, but he opted to work instead for Marvel Comics after applying. And after a short stint there, he left, returned to Pittsburgh, working in advertising, marketing, until moving back to DC Comics to work on Superman with Curt Swan, which is, again, huge. However, at this point, Shooter's reputation as being somewhat contentious had already formed. He was a big guy with a big personality, and this isn't to denigrate a man who recently passed. It is a very well-documented part of his life, but also part of his legend. He didn't get along well with Julius Schwartz, who was the editor of Superman at the time, or a lot of others, and it's been said that he was difficult to work under. Jim Shooter was a driven guy who grew up with a ton of pressure to succeed, and he did. And that kind of driving force makes people very successful, but it often makes them myopic and hard to work with. In 1975, Marv Wolfman hired Jim Shooter as editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics. There's frankly nobody who could say that the Shooter era of Marvel was anything short of transformative for the company or for comics. It saw the Chris Claremont and John Byrne X-Men, Byrne She-Hulk, Byrne Fantastic Four, Roger Stern Spider-Man, Roger Stern Avengers, Walt Simonson Thor, and of course Jim Shooter's own Contest of Champions, and his Secret Wars. And of course there was New Universe, which, while I remember it fondly, it was not well received at the time, and it did not hold up. But remember when I said that he was driven? People like John Byrne, also another one of those kind of guys, reportedly. And Marv Wolfman, not one of those kind of guys, reportedly. John Romita Sr. had pretty contentious relationships with him. And some even ended up leaving Marvel for DC. Byrne was one of those after Secret Wars. It's also worth noting that Shooter was not shy about prohibiting any talk of homosexuality or including characters that were gay in Marvel at all during his time there. Shooter's run, and as EIC, went from transformative in the early 80s, unquestionably, to pretty fraught by the time that he left in 1989. At that point, he started Valiant Entertainment with a few gold key characters and a stable of other quality creators. He wasn't the only one, but he was their editor. Valiant was on the cutting edge of the concept of new creator-owned comics in the way that Epic was at Marvel, which is something that Shooter created. He was a champion of creator ownership of characters and royalties. Valiant produced properties like X-O Manowar, Harbinger, Archer and Armstrong, and he stayed there until about 1999 while it changed hands and eventually became Acclaim Comics. 2 decades later, it would experience a huge revival. In 2007, Jim Shooter returned to the Legion of Superheroes for a very short period of time with DC, and then spent some time consulting on the gold key characters that he had foregrounded at Valiant, like Dr. Solar and Magnus Robot Fighter. I first saw news of his passing a few days ago when Mark Waid broke the news, eulogizing him. Mark, of course, had worked with and been influenced by Jim Shooter. Certainly anyone reading comics in the early 80s was, no question. He was a legend even then. He had been for 2 decades. And he still is today. While his legacy is complicated, there's no question that he was driven out of a love for the business that he was in and influenced so much for the benefit of kids, comics, American culture in general. He did transform things to a point where Marvel was able to spend more time, well, certainly during his time as EIC, Stan Lee was developing Marvel for television and film. And that did lay the groundwork for the eventual MCU. So, yeah, it's hard to say that things would be the way that they were without him. Thanks, Jim, for everything. Rest well. Thanks for watching. This has been the Doomcast. We'll see you next week.